Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the March 2023 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. I'm Chris Furman, the regional climatologist with NOAA's Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past month. Our other speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update, Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide an agricultural impacts update. Joining us today, we have David Zierden, the state climatologist for Florida, who will be discussing the impacts from the most recent La Nina and what we might expect as we head into spring and summer. So again, thank you all for joining us. Just a reminder to type your questions and comments into the question box at any time, and they'll be answered at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to this recording in the next day or so. All right, so let's get started with an overview of the climate. Next slide. All right, so starting with mean temperatures over the past month, we see mostly above average temperatures across the region, though many of the anomalies are not as large as what we saw back in February. For most of the region, temperatures were between 2 and 4 degrees above average. Across the southern tier of the region, we see temperatures running 4 to 6 degrees above average, especially in southern parts of Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and much of Florida, while a few locations in southern Georgia and northern Florida were running over 6 degrees above average over the past month. And on the right, we see the temperatures were pretty close to average across Puerto Rico, while the Virgin Islands have actually been running a bit below average over the past month. All right, next slide. Now, while mean temperatures have been above average across most of the region over the past month, if we look closely, we see that we've actually been on a bit of a roller coaster ride. On the left, we see mean temperature departures for the first 7 days of March. And what we see is a continuation of the warm weather that dominated the region starting actually back in late January. In fact, many locations across the southern tier of the region experienced their warmest start to the month of March, as seen by all the maroon colored rankings there in the figure on the right, particularly across parts of Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. Okay, next slide, please. However, as we discussed last time, a significant pattern shift was forecasted to occur around the middle of the month. And indeed, we began to see below average temperatures return to the region during the second week of the month, particularly across the northern tier of the region, which we see there in the figure on the left. And then the following week there on the right, we saw, in fact, some of the coldest weather we've seen in quite some time, extending all the way down to the Florida Peninsula. Next slide. In fact, if we look here at the figure on the left, we see that the lowest minimum temperatures observed during this period got down to between 30 and 35 degrees across parts of southern Georgia and much of the Florida Panhandle. That's the area shaded in yellow. This is significant because this is the range where we can see impacts from frost and freeze conditions. And as we know, many shrubs and crops in this area are in bloom due to all the warm weather. And Pam will actually talk a bit more about those impacts in her presentation. Now, this cold weather didn't last forever, and most of us saw a return to unseasonably warm weather late last week. If we look at the figure on the right, we see that outside of, say, the higher elevations and places near the immediate coast, temperatures reached 80 degrees across nearly the entire region, while mid-80s were observed as far north as southern Virginia, and some locations across Florida actually topped 90 degrees. Okay, next slide. So recall last month we saw how spring leaf out had arrived several weeks earlier than normal across much of the Southeast. Record warmth in January, February, and early March resulted in exceptionally high, and in some cases record high pollen counts. On the left, you can see the daily pollen count for Atlanta beginning in late February and running through yesterday. On March 7th, the pollen monitor in Atlanta, which has actually been recording for over 30 years, recorded its early count in the extremely high category, breaking the prior record by nearly 2 weeks. In Washington, D.C., tree pollen hit record levels for February, which is pretty impressive since phenology data there actually extend back over 150 years. The National Park Service, I'm sure some of you saw this, also reported that the DC cherry blossoms reached peak bloom this past Thursday, which is about a week and a half earlier than normal. So while this is early, it's actually not record-breaking. In fact, March 23rd is just the 9th earliest peak bloom date since records began over 100 years ago. And it's likely that the cooler weather that we saw in the middle of the month may have slowed the blooming slightly. Okay, next slide. So in terms of precipitation, the past month has been rather dry across much of the region. Several locations across southern Alabama and southern Georgia, as well as eastern sections of the Carolinas and Virginia, have only received up to about half of their expected precipitation over the past month, while much of the Florida Peninsula has only received up to about a quarter of their expected precipitation. On the right, we see that precipitation has been quite variable across Puerto Rico. In general, the central portion of the island has received decent rainfall over the past month, while the northern slopes continue to remain dry. Parts of the Virgin Islands have also been unusually dry, particularly on St. Croix, where some locations have actually barely received any measurable rainfall over the past 30 days or so. Using our forecast perspectives tool, if the precipitation forecast for the rest of this week verifies, then it's possible that some of our long-term stations in parts of Florida, the Virgin Islands, and in eastern portions of the Carolinas and Virginia may record one of their driest Marches on record. Okay, next slide. And so no surprise, the general warmth and dryness over the past month has led to an expansion and intensification of drought, particularly in places where short-term moisture deficits have been the greatest. Abnormally dry conditions expanded across southern Alabama and Georgia and across eastern portions of the Carolinas and Virginia, while moderate drought reemerged across parts of the western Florida Panhandle and extreme southern Alabama and southwest Georgia. Small pockets of moderate drought also emerged across the coastal plain of North Carolina. Now, most notably, drought conditions expanded and intensified across the Florida Peninsula, with severe drought emerging across much of the southwestern part of the state and also in a small pocket just north of Orlando. The threat for wildfires in the state remains high, and there are still some active burn bans in a few of the southwestern counties. Okay, next slide. Now, fortunately, parts of the region did receive some rainfall over the past several days as a frontal system stalled across the central portion of the region. The map here shows the radar estimated rainfall totals from Sunday morning through yesterday morning. And it shows mostly beneficial rainfall across the eastern Carolinas, but also very heavy rainfall across portions of Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, where some flood emergencies were issued yesterday morning. Okay, next slide. Okay, looking in the Caribbean, we see that abnormally dry conditions have expanded across Puerto Rico and the outlying islands, while growing precipitation deficits have led to an emergence of moderate drought in the northwest corner of the island. Again, despite being in the dry season, precipitation deficits across the Virgin Islands have continued to grow, with some locations recording only about half of their usual rainfall through the first 3 months of the year. Now, this has led to decreasing decreasing groundwater and stream flow levels and more widespread signs of vegetation stress. It also has some farmers concerned about water availability for irrigation. So as such, the island of St. Croix was downgraded this past week from moderate to severe drought. Okay, next slide. All right, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this since David's going to cover it in detail here in a little bit. But as we saw a few weeks ago, La Niña has ended, and ENSO neutral conditions are expected to continue at least through spring and summer. Beyond that, there's a chance we could transition to El Nino maybe as early as this summer, but forecast confidence is rather low at the moment, and there's no consensus between the dynamical and statistical models, which is not uncommon this time of year. Okay, next slide. So real briefly, looking out over the next 3 months, we see that the Climate Prediction Center is forecasting above average temperatures across the southeast. There are equal chances of above and below average precipitation across most of the region, except across Virginia and some small parts there of western North Carolina, extreme northern Alabama, and Georgia. They're expected to be wetter than average, though the probabilities are not all that high. Again, as we've mentioned before, with La Niña conditions fading across the equatorial Pacific, there's more uncertainty in these longer range forecasts, particularly for precipitation. Okay, next slide. Looking at the drought outlook, we see the conditions are projected to be pretty good across the region through at least midsummer, with drought removal expected across Florida as we enter the wet season. and no other drought development is currently expected across the mainland southeast. Now, in contrast, drought is expected to persist and expand across Puerto Rico, and in fact, there are already signs of that on the initial drafts of this week's drought monitor. Okay, next slide. So looking ahead to this weekend and early next week, warm and wet conditions are expected across the southeast. Next slide. Looking a little more closely at precipitation here, we see another round of storms coming in later this week, which could drop as much as a couple inches of rain across the northern Gulf Coast and into southern Georgia. That's certainly good news for the emerging and intensifying dryness there. But unfortunately, most of Florida will likely be left out, and that may result in further degradations on the drought monitor. In fact, early drafts of this week's map show an expansion of severe drought likely across the peninsula. Okay, next slide. Looking out to 2 weeks, we see a continuation of generally warm and wet conditions across the region, much like we saw in the 6 to 10 day. All right, next slide. And if we look out 3 to 4 weeks, we see that the southern tier of the region is expected to remain warm, while equal chances of above and below average temperatures are expected across the rest of the region. In terms of precipitation, equal chances are found across the majority of the region except the Florida Peninsula, where precipitation is actually leaning above average in the 3 to 4 week time frame. Okay, next slide. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. Here's a summary for you to look over after the webinar. I'm also happy to answer any questions at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Todd.
Thank you very much. So I'll go ahead and get started. And this was a sort of a complicated briefing to do. I put it together yesterday, and we had a lot of flooding here yesterday. So as I go through these slides, I'll describe them, and we'll start with just looking at the southeast. So here's a snapshot on the left-hand side. Now remember, these on all of these first few slides, they're 28-day average stream flows. So it is looking not just at yesterday, but it's also looking further back into the past to see where we are. So this is looking at the region as a whole. And if you look on the left-hand side, the USGS graphic showing us having below normal stream flow in a lot of our areas, North Carolina, South Carolina, all through the Alabama and Mississippi area, and then parts of South Florida. And part of the reason for that is, as you look over on the right-hand side, when you look at the duration hydrograph, what you can see is that this is the time of year we expect our stream flows to be the highest for most of the southeast. That's not including Florida, the peninsula of Florida, simply because they're in their dry season right now. And but as you look at it as a whole, we ended up getting very wet in that January and February timeframe, and we're just almost above normal. But this is the time of year when we would expect rainfall in the area and some flooding in the area. And things dropped off very quickly over just that 1 month when we were expecting rainfall. Again, if we were in the fall and we saw that kind of saw that kind of drying out, that wouldn't be unusual. Because if you look in the September to kind of the November timeframe, you see how it naturally falls during that time. Well, we don't typically expect it to get this dry this time of year. We expect to have some flooding. We expect to have, we don't expect this kind of dryness. So this was unusual. It was, as was mentioned by Chris before, it was warmer than normal and it was drier than normal. So let's go ahead and look at each of the states. You'll see a similar pattern. And so when we look at Alabama, you can see that how quickly, again, it dried out. So this is kind of the pattern for the most of the southeast, is that we were very wet as we got to the end of January, approaching February. So we were looking at an untypical La Niña winter, where we do expect below normal rainfall, and then we very quickly switched back to being very dry and warm, and things went downhill very quickly from a drought perspective. You look at the next one, that's Georgia. Very similar thing happened there. And then when we go to Florida, you see that one's a little bit different. We're getting to the part now where we have a dry part of we came out of the fall tropical season, and we're supposed to be a little bit drier, and now we are, and now they continue to dry out this time of year. And so we're looking as we approach the summer to start to see improvements as we get into the summer and start to get into the wet season. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And this shows our South Carolina, and you see a similar pattern through South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Where we were wet, we were actually closer to normal there as opposed to being above normal, but have quickly dropped off and are now below normal in a lot of these places across the state. So let's go ahead and go to our next slide. So the interesting part is that as I was doing this yesterday and seeing all of that information, I also had to deal with possible moderate, a lot of minor flooding across, but many moderates, and we have a couple of major floods in the southeast. And when I get to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about that, but that swath of rain that Chris showed through there and an earlier rain that affected the top of the Mississippi had a big impact on the southeast. So we were in decent shape as far as our reservoirs go, going as we were coming out of spring or coming out of winter and going into spring, but we were starting to dry out a little earlier than we would have expected. But this has had a big impact on our water resources in the area, and so we're not quite as dry. We have more water than we know what to do with. But that wasn't quite the case. I think up in the Carolinas and in Virginia, it was beneficial rainfall, and as opposed to South Carolina and what we saw, that swath of rainfall, because that ended on Monday. Chris's graphic showed the Monday ending, and this is kind of ending Monday, but we still had a lot more rainfall come in during the Monday timeframe, and then we've had rain come in this morning to across the south part of our area and the panhandle of Florida. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, because this kind of talks about the climatology of the southeast. We are in week 12 of the year, and this is a time of year when we would expect some flooding during this time of year. So one of the things we have to do as we do these forecasts looking forward is that we have to understand that even though we're drying out and everything else, things can change very, very quickly. As we look at climatology, we see that we're supposed to have flooding, but we were really drying out. And as we go into the weeks ahead, things kind of slow down. We get leafing out of the trees. We get more competition for the water. And so we see where we start to think about drought. We start to think about not having enough water for the reservoirs, for all that. This is the time when we recharge. So we were concerned about that, but very quickly we have seen a lot of water and now don't have anywhere to put it. So this is the one thing we do have to be concerned with. One of the graphics Chris showed about the drought outlook talked about us being in good shape going forward, and now it really does look like we're in good shape going forward. The one area that they showed improvements is the Florida peninsula. Because we're heading into the wet season, they've been very, very dry, but it looks like our wet season could end up being a normal type wet season, and they could come out of it very quickly. But anyway, so in week 12 of the year, things should start quieting down. But again, we can get flooding in any week of the year, so we have to be prepared for that regardless. So let's go ahead and go forward to the next slide. And this just kind of looks at it looks like from the April and June timeframe, for most of the southeast, we are looking at a near normal risk for flooding across the area. And when we say near normal, I was just talking about that. We expect flooding during this time of year. So for us to receive, the rainfall was above normal, and some of the actual points that went into moderate and even major floods, that's above normal. But as a whole over the southeast, this is the normal chance for flooding. And so we always have to be careful about how we describe whether we're above normal and below normal, and what is our risk. Our risk, even though we say near normal risk, that risk can be high at any time. And we saw that in the last couple of days. But we have a below normal risk for flooding as we look into Florida, at least during that time frame. it will take some time to start to come out of that as we approach the summer and the wet season in Florida. So with that, we'll go to the last slide, which is just the overview slide, and you can review that later. I went through this very quickly yesterday, and there's a lot of conflicting things. So if it doesn't make any sense to you at some point, if you want to contact the Southeast RFC and me and ask some questions, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, we will pass it off to Pam to talk about our about the agricultural impacts.
All right, well, thank you, Todd. As I drove over the rivers on my way to work this morning, I saw they were running really high here in Athens. So let's jump right in. Mostly the impacts this month I will be talking about are impacts on fruit. As Chris mentioned earlier, we did get down at below freezing, and this is a count of the number of days that we got below 32 degrees in the last 30 days. So you can see it wasn't just one day of frost in a lot of our more northern locations, but several days. Fortunately, in the commercial blueberry belt down in South Georgia, South Alabama, and the coastal Carolinas, they had only one frost. It probably only got down into about 30, so they were able to do frost protection for a lot of that, although some areas did get hit as well. So let's go on. And this is a thermograph of Macon, which is sort of in central Georgia, showing the actual daily high and low temperature in gray there superimposed on the long-term climate record for the Macon area. This is a long record of over 100 years. And you can see that time period from really about February 19 to March 15, where we were above normal, way above normal. In fact, we're temperatures that were more like May than they were like late February, early March. And then we drifted back down. During that time period, got a lot of people asking about whether it was okay to plant things like corn, and the soil temperature was quite warm then, but we could look ahead and see that pattern shift to a cooler climate was coming. And so I said, well, you better hold off. Some people did go ahead and plant anyway, especially in South Georgia where temperatures were more mild. You can see that black line I drew in there is the 32-degree line. And so we went for that long period with no frost at all in central Georgia. And then in 2 time periods within a week, we had freezing temperatures again. And that caused a lot of damage to the fruit because of the warm temperatures, everything was blooming like crazy, especially the early blooming varieties. And then they got hit by the frost, and there was some real devastation with that. So let me go ahead and talk about that on the next slide. Some of the recent impacts of the conditions on agriculture. Our peaches here in Athens were blooming. They were hit by frost. I visited down in Griffin last week and looked at the research orchard there, and all the early blooming varieties were severely hit by frost. In fact, the estimates there are probably near 100% loss. The later varieties did a little bit better. Those are varieties that require more chill hours, and as you'll see in a minute, they didn't really get it, but that means that the bloom date kind of spreads out over time. And so that was kind of an issue. Commercial blueberries in southeast Georgia did not get too cold, so they were able to do some frost protection. But you can see the pictures to the left there show that the day before the frost happened, this is just north of Athens, a little pick your own kind of place. They started out green, they got frost, and they lost their whole blueberry field and overnight. You can see the damage was just amazing. And so that was a real loss to those farmers, and they've been hit for several years in a row, and so they are really hurting with that. Folks that have been planting corn, especially sweet corn, because of the market, if they get it in early, they can get it to market early and charge more money for it, lost a lot of their leaves, but the growing point for that corn in many cases was still below ground, and the ground was warm enough to protect it. There were a few that will probably have to be replanted. Others should grow out of it, and it just puts a delay on the crops a little bit. Many farmers did opt to wait until late in the month to plant because of the worry about frost, especially with the pattern change that happened, and that probably was a really good choice for this year. Drought in Florida has resulted in a lot of widespread irrigation and pasture issues. It's becoming more of an issue in the areas where drought has expanded in South Alabama and Georgia, but probably not yet because there's not a lot of crops that are really developed yet. And then because we're Georgia and we always talk about the Vidalia onions, it is predicted that they will have lost some yield this year because of the December frost. Remember that cold period right around Christmas. That caused some problems for the Vidalias. But they do have an official pack date of April 17, which is exciting news for Vidalia. That's about the same as last year. They have had it earlier. I remember in, I think, 2017, it was about 5 days earlier than that. So a lot of the fruit are what's being affected this year. When we go into next month, we'll be more in the main part of the growing season, and I'll talk more about field crops at that point. We go on. This shows us the soil temperature. This is just for the last week. It had been running way above normal, and then we went back to a colder pattern, and you can see how cold that soil temperature is now. It does slow down germination of things that were just put into the ground, but I think with the warmer temperatures and the sunshine, that should improve. Soil moisture here shows that band of rain across the southern part of Georgia and Alabama, and that this is just a 20 centimeters, so it's near the surface. It responds pretty quickly to recent rainfalls. So that'll be something we'll be watching over time. If we go on, here's the chill hour accumulation. This is for Peach County, just south of Macon in central Georgia. And you can see that this year has ended up with fewer chill hours than last year even, and way below the long-term historical average due to the warm winter that we've had this year and we've been seeing more frequently in recent years. That has had mixed consequences. It means that the varieties that require a lot of chill did not really get enough chill hours to produce a nice uniform bloom. That may actually save them because some of the blooms will be coming out later and they may actually be able to get some peaches out of that. So oddly, even though we had a really warm winter, it may have saved the yield for some varieties of peaches. But this is something we're going to watch. We got off to a good start, but it just really dragged as we went through all this really warm weather. And this will be the last time you'll see this probably until next winter. So if we go on, freeze probability. This is the freeze probability. 1 out of 10 years we'll have a frost later than this date. You can see now we're in the royal blue area, which really covers a lot of South Georgia, South Alabama, and coastal Carolinas, at least South Carolina. So most of those areas have a less than 1 in 10% chance now of getting a frost. I looked ahead on the forecast. I don't really see another frost coming. That doesn't mean it can't happen, but it's becoming increasingly rare that we'll get a frost that late. And so to me, that's a hopeful sign that many of these areas may have seen their last frost for the season. At least through April 6th, things look pretty good. We'll just have to wait and see. If we go on, here's my summary, and I'll let you look at that later. And now it's my pleasure to introduce David Zierden, who's I'm glad you put this picture in, David. I was wondering if you were going to. Who I've been looking forward to for probably a month already to see what he has to say about La Niña. And so I'm going to pass it over to David and take it away.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Pam. And this just is a fun picture. It was from last week off beautiful St. George Island, Florida. Great fishing day. I think the dog likes fishing even more than I do, but just some of the beautiful spring weather we're enjoying down here. But we'll go ahead and get started. And what I was asked to present here today is to do kind of a post-mortem on this last La Niña event that's lasted over 3 years in the tropical Pacific. And as Chris Furman said earlier, as of last month, we are no longer in La Niña conditions. We are officially in neutral, but we did go through 3 consecutive cold seasons under La Niña conditions. So we'll go into that a little more depth. Let me start here by just a little bit of just basic background. The El Nino La Niña cycle occurs in the Pacific Ocean along the equator from the coast of South America all the way to the international date line. And every 2 to 7 years, this whole area, due to ocean dynamics and changes in trade winds, gets to be anomalously warm. as we see with two of the major La Nina events of the past century, 1997 and 2015 and 2016, where these red areas represent ocean sea surface temperatures that are several degrees Celsius warmer than normal. Well, this cycle also has two other phases: the neutral phase, when sea surface temperatures are close to normal, and the La Nina phase, where that same area cools down several degrees Celsius colder than normal. And all of these phases have different impacts on the climate and the upper air circulation across North America and other portions of the globe. Like I say, we have been in 3 consecutive years of La Nina. We'll go to the next slide and show the current sea surface temperature anomalies. And what we see is there's still a little bit of colder water in the central Pacific, shown by the blue shading, but the eastern Pacific and a lot of the region is now starting to warm up and is actually warmer than normal. So we're definitely no longer in La Nina conditions. Another thing that sticks out on this map is all the cold water off the coast of California and the western United States. Due to the constant storminess and increased upwelling and turbulence, this area of the Pacific is actually much colder than normal right now, which is quite a change from the 4 to 5 years of drought they experienced earlier that went hand in hand with warmer ocean temperatures. So with that, we'll go to the next slide and we'll start tracking this El Nino La Nina cycle. Over on the left is a common index used for sea surface temperatures in that equatorial regions, just called the Nino 3.4 index. But the red spikes are when we're in the El Nino or warm phase, and the blue valleys are when we're in the La Nina or cold phase. And this shows the coming and going of this cycle since 1982. A couple things that stick out is, you notice the El Nino events tend to be 1-year events, where the La Nina or cold phase often extends 2 to 3 years, as it did back in the 1980s, again, 1999 through 2001 or so, 2008 and 2007 was a 2-year La Nina event, and most recently 2020 through 23, again a multi-year La Nina event. And I read earlier this year that these 3-year La Nina events were fairly rare. Well, not really. Over on the right-hand side is the official categorization by NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, where all the numbers in blue shading are the sea surface temperature anomalies. And you see this latest event lasted 3 years. Again, back in 2010, it lasted at least 2.5 years. Back in 1998 through 2001, lasted 3 years again. So it's really not that unusual to have a 3-year La Nina event. So, but that has big implications, as we'll go into on the next slide. The first implication is to the hurricane season in the Atlantic Basin. And it's well known that the El Nino or warm phase in the Pacific Ocean leads to unfavorable upper level winds over the Atlantic Basin, and usually a less active hurricane season in the Atlantic Basin, where the opposite is kind of true with La Nina, where it's a more favorable environment and we typically get more hurricanes and tropical systems in the Atlantic Basin. And here's an old study we did here at FSU. We looked at landfalling hurricanes in the United States over a more than 100-year period. And we simply broke it down into the 3 different phases of the Pacific Ocean and plotted it as a exceedance curve. And so the way to read this is the likelihood of 1 or more hurricanes occurring in a given year is pretty high for all 3 phases of the Pacific Ocean, over 70% to nearly 90% for the La Nina phase. But when you get to 2 or more hurricane landfalls, it really starts to separate. only a 30% chance during the El Nino phase, where now we're up at a 65% chance during La Nina, or over twice as likely. And that separation is even greater for 3 or more hurricane landfalls in a year, still up near 40% for the La Nina phase. So this is a well-known, one of the major factors that go into the seasonal hurricane forecast. On the next slide, we'll look how this worked out. Each of the last 3 years, each of the last 3 hurricane seasons were forecast to be more active than normal. Luckily, this last hurricane season, 2022, the number of storms and hurricanes and landfalls was actually less than predicted, which was a nice reprieve. Only one hurricane made landfall on the Gulf Coast. That was a big one, Hurricane Ian. But other than that, we got a little bit of a reprieve in 2022. The other 2 seasons influenced by La Nina, 2021, and then there was the record-breaking season of 2020. And what I'd like to really call attention to is in 2021, there were 6 landfalls along the Gulf Coast, which really tend to impact our area in the southeast the most. And in 2020, we had 10 landfalls on the Gulf Coast. So it was kind of a welcome reprieve for this region in 2022 that kind of went against the usual grain of what La Nina would expect. So on the next slide, we'll start talking about the usual impacts on our jet stream, and they're most strongly felt during the winter months or the cold weather months of November through March. And this schematic shows kind of our conceptual model, where when we have cold water in the Pacific, or again La Nina, we tend to get a jet stream set up like this across the United States, with ridging over the Gulf of Alaska and the Western Pacific, and a mean trough over the Mississippi Valley. But this kind of leads to a storm track that goes up northern Alabama, Tennessee, the Mississippi and Ohio Valley, but leaves the southern tier of the United States drier and warmer than normal. And that's what we typically expect from La Nina. And down at the bottom, I just have composites of precipitation departures from normal during the La Nina phase. It's a composite from all the past La Nina events. And this isn't great quality, so it doesn't show as much detail as I would like, but you see through January, February, March, even November and December, we see the yellow and brown shading corresponding to drier than normal conditions along the northern Gulf Coast, southern Texas, certainly the Florida Peninsula, but also we see that storm track up the Mississippi Valley. Now, this is kind of critical because from La Nina event to La Nina event, the exact placement of this storm track can vary. And sometimes it extends down well into northern Alabama, even northwest Georgia, and can actually be beneficial for the headwaters of the ACF basin, where other years it's further north and the whole area is drier than normal and leading to drought. So it's always kind of a guessing game where that storm track is going to set up. It might have some implications with the strength of the La Nina event, but it's really hard to flesh out. So on the next slide, with this conceptual model in mind, this was the official CPC Climate Prediction Center winter outlook for this last season, December through February. And here's the very familiar pattern: the high probability of above normal temperatures across the southern tier of the United States, especially the southeast, and also a higher chance of below normal rainfall across the southern tier, southern Texas, the Florida Peninsula, the northern Gulf Coast. And this is very similar to the previous 2 years' winter outlook when we were also under La Nina conditions. So on the next slide, we'll go ahead and see what actually occurred. And we'll start the winter of 2020, 2021. These are the actual temperature departures from normal on the left and precipitation departures from normal on the right. And looking at temperature, most of the United States was warmer than normal, consistent with recent trends over the last couple decades. But also you'll notice the warmer temperatures are in the northern tier, cooler temperatures in the southern tier, which is kind of opposite what we'd expect from La Nina. And over on the right, looking at precipitation, California was drier than normal, still in the midst of its 4 to 5 year drought. But across Texas, the southeast United States, the deep south, really a mixed bag, a couple pockets of dryness, actually wetter than normal across the coastal Carolinas. So definitely not what you'd expect from a typical La Nina. We'll go to the next slide and look at now the following year, 2021-22. Again, this is November through March. The temperature departures from normal over on the left. Again, most of the United States warmer than normal, but not really a clear La Nina pattern there. Over on the right, with the precipitation departures from normal, we do see the La Nina pattern starting to show up. Drier than normal California, especially Southern California, the Northern Gulf Coast, coastal Carolinas, but the exception is the Florida Peninsula. It still fared very well during the winter of 2021-22, despite being in La Nina conditions. We'll go now ahead to the next slide, this past winter months, and it's been all topsy-turvy. The temperature departures from normal over on the left. You see how the western half of the nation actually cooler than normal due to the persistent troughing and storminess they've experienced. The eastern half of the nation, again, warmer than normal, but not quite the typical La Nina pattern. Looking at precipitation, you see the record-breaking rainfall and precipitation in southern and central California. We do see some dryness showing up in southern Texas and again in the state of Florida and the Florida Peninsula. So there is a little bit of a La Nina signature, but then Louisiana, Mississippi, and a lot of the other deep south very much wetter than normal. So still not a one-to-one correspondence of what we'd expect from La Nina. So we'll go into the next slide, and I want to talk about the connection with drought now. And especially when we get these multi-year La Nina events in the southeast, which lead to 1 or more years of drier and warmer than normal conditions, it's usually the trigger for widespread and extended drought. And this is the area of the southeast, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor, going back to 2000, in the various stages of drought. And what I've circled are when we have these multi-year La Nina events. Again, 1999 through 2002, 2007 and 2008, which was really a devastating drought across the region. Again, 2010 through 2012, widespread and persistent drought across the region. But look at the latest multi-year La Nina event, 2020 or 21 through the current. We have some pockets of drought appearing and then disappearing, but we don't have the widespread and persistent drought that we've seen previously throughout history. And going back further into last century, the 1970s, the mid-1950s, a very good correspondence with these multi-year La Nina events that really didn't materialize this time. So but that's my biggest take-home message is, as far as drought goes, the southeast region has really dodged a bullet with this multi-year La Nina event. So go to the next slide. We saw this earlier from Chris. This is the current U.S. Drought Monitor. La Nina got one last blow in before it died for the state of Florida, where drought is intensifying across the peninsula. You know, we see pockets of severe drought, and most of the peninsula is at least in moderate drought. This continues to intensify. We're getting a lot more drought monitoring reports through the Drought Mitigation Center. So it's something we're going to pay close attention to. It won't be until late May when the summer rainy season kicks in. So we've got at least another month or more to endure before things are likely to get better widespread. So We'll go to the next slide. One last thing, we've had severe weather's been in the news with the terrible tornado outbreak. There is a connection between the Pacific Ocean and the occurrence of tornadoes. And this is an old study done here at our center, but it's been backed up by other studies and still holds true that during the winter and early March, tornado activity is actually enhanced in the deep south or Dixie Alley when we're in the La Nina phase. And on top of that, over on the right, this is kind of the longer term trend, a study by Victor Gensini and others showing that tornado environment, favorable environments are increasing in frequency in the deep south, the Mississippi Valley and such. So all of this is consistent with what we've seen with severe weather over the last week or more. So with that, I think it's my wrap-up slide. I'll leave it there for reference, but I think I'm done, and we can take any questions from myself or any of the other speakers.
That's wonderful. First of all, I'd like to thank our regular presenters, Chris, Todd, and Pam, and our special guest presenter today, David Searden, for that excellent overview. Agree, we definitely dodged a bullet in terms of drought across the region. My name is Meredith Muth. I work with NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System. We co-organize this webinar series 3 years running, along with our partners at the Southeast Regional Climate Center and the National Weather Service. We will be sending out a summary of the webinar along with a recording link. Please feel free to share with your networks and colleagues. Our next webinar will be on April 25th, where we'll be talking about how does a warming planet affect precipitation in the Southeast? And we'll be following up with that in May and June with some discussions on heat risk in the region, as well as our annual hurricane outlook. If you have any questions for any of the speakers or even comments on what you heard today, or in general, anything about climate in the region, please feel free right now to add it into the question box. Also, when you leave the webinar today, a quick pop-up survey will come up, just a few questions. If there's information that you would like to learn more about in terms of a special presentation, please go ahead and add that in. And we also, we're eager to hear your thoughts on how we can improve this series. And so right now, I would like to first, before we open it up to questions, to see if we have any additional comments from any speakers in terms of what you heard today. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
Yeah, this is David Searden. I just had a question for Todd Hamill. I know he's done a lot of work in this area. When we talked about where that storm track sets up during the typical La Nina, whether it's across North Alabama or Northwest Georgia, do you have any insight or intuition on how to better predict that? Is it the strength of the La Nina? Is it just doing better day-to-day monitoring? What is your take on that?
You know, I don't think there's, I think a lot of times El Nino and a strong El Nino, there's a more clearer picture when we look at that side of it. Obviously, in the last few years, La Nina has not been as predictable. You know, I know that we have our however many years being able to look back and talk about that, but it seems that, like I said, in the last 3 years, it has not been nearly as predictable, or as, I think, obviously weather has something to do with that. Our climatology, you know, would suggest, in looking at the past, that you know, maybe a stronger La Nina would bring us, you know, warmer, bring us drier temperature or drier conditions from south to north. I think more we had that in, but even this year we probably would have been in a drought, like I was recently talking about, that, you know, we're coming out of a La Nina, and that might have had an impact too. But for the most of the season, we've been dry. It's just taken a couple of events that has kept us from getting into that. So I think that some of it, while the patterns have hinted and shown a way to be dry during that time, I think that weather has an impact on that, and all it takes is a couple of events to subvert that and keep us from going into a drought. And I you know, and this recent event is a perfect example of that. We could have been talking about a drought coming out of that La Nina for this month and going into the spring, but very quickly it turns just like that. So, you know, I think it does the big picture okay, but some of these smaller scale things that impact it do have an impact on what's going on.
Great, thank you so much. We have a number of comments thanking David for the overview, the detailed overview of La Nina and ENSO, so thank you. A question about getting the copy of the slides and presentations. As a reminder, we will send out an email to all registered participants that will include a link to the YouTube video. If you need specific slides, feel free to reach out. I have a question here for David regarding La Nina and ENSO writ large. Does the arming of the Arctic affect the path of the La Nina atmospheric rivers, such as seen this winter onto California?
That's a great question. Yeah, I don't know if there's an answer to that yet. You know, that is a really emerging field in climate science, is just how does the warming of the Arctic affect our jet streams, and does it make them more wavy or more susceptible to these blocking patterns that we've seen this winter? It's emerging science. Some studies say yes, some are not as definitive. How that interacts with La Nina is probably not really well known right now. So I think it's an open question. It's one that I always have in my mind. Is I like what Todd Hamill said about the El Nino phase still being a little more consistent and predictable than the La Nina phase. But, you know, as the background climate continues to change, are those relationships going to stay the same? It's a very difficult question, and yeah, so it's something that we don't have a lot of answers to right now.
Great, thank you, David. And I think with that, we are out of questions. So one more time, thank you to all of our presenters, and we hope to see all of you in March for our discussion, in April for our next webinar series presentation. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.